Welcome to the Just Solutions podcast, where we will explore relevant projects, policies, and stories from the perspective of the communities most impacted by climate change: Black, Indigenous, people of color, and those with lower incomes. I'm Aiko Schaefer, Executive Director of Just Solutions, and I'm regularly your host, but today I'm excited to hand over the show to Zully Juarez, Senior Research and Policy Analyst at Just Solutions. Zully is an urban planner and environmental justice advocate based in Los Angeles, California, where she first got involved in the movement as a youth activist with Communities for a Better Environment, further pursuing her interests well into her academic and professional career. Before joining Just Solutions, Zully worked with LA-based grassroots organizations and academic institutions to address the impacts of environmental health hazards and pollution. Zully received her Master of Urban and Regional Planning from UCLA and a Bachelor of Arts from UC Berkeley. In today's episode, we'll examine the role of community-engaged research in advancing environmental justice with the authors of the recently published book called Ground Truths: Community-Engaged Research for Environmental Justice. Let's dive into the interview.
Welcome to today's episode. I am Zully Juarez, Senior Research and Policy Analyst at Just Solutions, where I work to identify, research, and analyze existing environmental policies, procedures, and laws. I'm excited to be hosting this episode of the Just Solutions podcast. Today, I am joined by three guests: Martha Matsuoka, a professor of urban and environmental policy at Occidental College. Martha grew up in the movement for environmental justice, which continues to anchor and inform her teachings, research, and activism. Our second guest is Chad Raphael, a professor of communication at Santa Clara University. Chad has been a community organizer, funder, and researcher for environmental justice for over 25 years. Our third guest is Carolina Prado, an assistant professor of Latino Studies at San Francisco State University, working at the intersections of community-based research, environmental justice, and border studies. Our guests are all involved in community-engaged research for environmental justice and represent fields of urban planning, community economic development, food justice and sovereignty, public participation and conservation, and public health. Welcome, Martha, Chad, and Carolina, to the Just Solutions podcast.
Thank you, Zully, and thanks to all at Just Solutions. We're so thrilled to be here today to share our new book. It's Ground Truths: Community Engaged Research for Environmental Justice. So thank you so much for having us today.
So today we're talking about community-engaged community research and the recently released book co-created by our guest titled Ground Truths: Community-Engaged Research for Environmental Justice. This is the first book devoted entirely to summarizing the body of community-engaged research on environmental justice, how we can conduct more of it, and how we can do it better. Martha, I would like to start it off with you by sharing, what were the main objectives of the Ground Truths book?
When we started this book, the book was really a brainchild that came out of a conference that was held at Santa Clara University in 2019, pre-pandemic, that really focused on the role of university community partnerships. And so out of that, Chad put together a number of ideas and invited a number of us to join in to kind of create this book. So it has its origins in long decades of organizing and movement in the environmental justice movement, sparked in more recent years by this conference that was held in 2019. The book really has 5 goals. The first, of course, was, we wanted to put together a volume that focused specifically on community-engaged research for environmental justice. We knew there were many great books on community-engaged research, as there were numbers of books about environmental justice already written, but there was no single volume that synthesized the community-engaged research approach for environmental justice. So we wanted to focus the book on our primary audience of professional researchers, people in academia, government, and advocacy organizations. It was a particular audience, but we knew there were excellent resources available that had been written by our partners, community partners, for a community level audience. And our role was to speak to the professional researchers to do more and to do better. Our second goal was really to demonstrate how community engaged research advances environmental justice. And we do that in 4 different ways, certainly by centering local knowledge, secondly, by building truth from the ground up, thirdly, producing actionable data that can influence decisions, and in transforming researchers' relationships to communities for equity and mutual benefit. Our third goal was to establish a framework on how community-engaged research and EJ align on concepts of justice and how those concepts apply in various fields of urban planning, public health, conservation, law and policy, which we'll hear from in a second, community economic development, and food justice and sovereignty. And Chad will talk a little bit about what those concepts of justice look like in both those realms. Our fourth goal was to involve multiple perspectives and fields. Chad and I each brought our own experiences and disciplinary perspectives to the book project, and yet we recognize that our knowledge was situated in individual perspectives and experiences, and we needed additional ones to be on our own for more collective authorship. So we reached out to early career Black, Indigenous, and scholars of color who are doing community-engaged research in their respective fields and invited them to co-author chapters with us. And then lastly, our primary and fundamental goal was to create a book that was widely accessible. So we opted for an open access book that anyone could download at no cost.
Thank you, Martha. Thank you so much for sharing. When I was at Eastern Communities for Environmental Justice, and we honored Martha for her work and dedication in the environmental justice field. So it brings me so much joy to have you here, Martha, and sharing this book with us.
Thanks so much, Zully. It's great to be here.
Chad, can you share what differentiates community-engaged research from other types of research approaches and why it's especially valuable for environmental justice?
I think what's unique about community-engaged research is that it advances justice through the research process, not just through the findings. The EJ movement has always aimed to build frontline communities' participation and power in decisions that affect them, rather than those communities just being at the mercy of outside experts. And this includes decisions about research, about what gets studied, who gets to do it, who gets paid to do it, whose knowledge is included, who gets to own and control the data, and who gets to tell the story of the findings to the community, the media, and policymakers. So compared with research conducted by outside experts, however well-meaning they may be, community-engaged research makes this unique contribution by growing communities' power and capacity to produce knowledge about themselves. Community-engaged research also allows communities to draw on the kinds of knowledge that they often know better than outsiders. The local experiential knowledge of how farm workers and their kids react to exposures to pesticides, for example, or suspected cancer clusters, or a rash of miscarriages in a neighborhood, or the traditional ecological knowledge that Indigenous communities have developed over thousands of years. So, compared with traditional academic or government research, community-engaged research can focus on topics that are more relevant to communities. It can extend the reach of that research beyond academic journals and government websites as community partners share it with their neighbors and political representatives. And it can help make the research more rigorous by drawing on local resources and perspectives. Ground truthing, which gives the book its title, involves communities checking up on official data that's often produced by people outside the community, by comparing it with actual conditions on the ground. For example, by measuring air or water pollution for themselves, or going around and doing a community epidemiological study of rates of illness. Community-engaged research can also be a powerful antidote to the growth of misinformation on social media and the news media. Community members who are involved in doing this research themselves are more likely to believe it and to act on their findings than if they're passive recipients of knowledge produced by outside experts. And when those community members present their research to their neighbors, that becomes a really credible form of testimony that can help overcome misinformation and mistrust that's being circulated in the wider community.
Thank you, Chad. What you shared reminded me of a quote from the book that says, EJ is best served when communities exercise power to produce and control their own knowledge to inform and influence decisions affecting residents. And now, both for Chad and Carolina, reflecting on your experiences, what are the key considerations when it comes to engaging in community-engaged research to advance environmental justice? And Chad, we can start with you.
One of the key considerations at the very start of these projects is the kind of preparatory work that outside researchers need to do in order to be good collaborators with their community partners. And that involves really deeply looking at one's positionality. Because community-engaged research requires researchers to redefine their traditional roles, it involves them unlearning dominant ways of being as much as learning new ones. So outside researchers need to prepare themselves to collaborate respectfully and justly with community partners. And we devoted a chapter in the book to how they can do that, which is co-written with Floridelma Boas Lopez from UCLA. Researchers' first step is often to carefully examine their own positioning and power in relation to the community and how they can address those differences with our community partners. Some of those differences come from our individual positioning, our race, our gender, our language, our education, and so on. So we need training in cultural competence and cultural humility and conflict management to address the inevitable conflicts that are going to arise in any relationship. We're also positioned by our academic disciplines, some of which have really fraught histories with communities. Black communities know about the Tuskegee experiment, when medical researchers left Black subjects syphilis untreated to see what would happen without telling them. And Indigenous communities know that archaeologists have plundered their ancestors' artifacts and bones, and that medical researchers have taken their DNA without consent to study. So we need training in research ethics from a decolonizing perspective, for example, that recognizes that community organizations often ought to own and control the data produced in a study. We're also positioned by our institutional affiliations. So we have to ask how we can address our institution's historic impacts on our community partners, which might include displacement, gentrification, and so on, while sharing our institution's resources with the community. And we're positioned by factors specific to the research project, the research questions, the choice of community, and so on. So we need to be ready to negotiate that research agenda with our community partners, not dictate it. And we even need to be ready to rethink our initial definition of the community itself and to represent the internal diversity of that community in the leadership of the project.
I also think that adding into, the preparation work of these collaborations is adding a power analysis of where the project would fit into the overall environmental justice goals of like a campaign or an organization's work. That is a little bit different than the sort of traditional academic structure of research design. So trying to think strategically about where the research work itself will fit into the work to make change.
Related to this question for Carolina, how can community-based participatory research impact public participation in law for environmental justice advocacy?
Yeah, so one important way in which community-based participatory research impacts public participation is through one, defining and legitimizing problems, both in the eyes of policymakers and the community. And this is done in different ways. One way is that CBPR makes problems visible through research. So the research can help working with community members in defining and documenting environmental hazards or environmental injustices, and by producing usable knowledge that they can use to persuade decision makers to act. Community engaged research can also play a role in addressing the feasibility, desirability, and the effectiveness of potential organizing and policy strategies. And many times the data that comes from community environmental research projects can be used as an entry point to gain legitimacy in the policy process by contributing to public comments, securing meetings with elected officials to discuss problems, sometimes also using data to get on an agenda of a policymaking institution or organization, and also identifying policy remedies. Another big way in which CBPR impacts public participation for environmental justice is specifically through engaging in politics, through looking at politically viable solutions to problems, through the process of proposing them, discussing them, and selecting them. And so those two kind of particular streams, as we talk about in the book, the problem stream and the policy stream, are particular ways in which community engaged research is used for public participation for environmental justice.
Can you share an example of how community engaged research has led to successful program or policy implementation?
Yeah, so as we had been talking about, engaging in politics with CBPR focuses on winning passage of policy changes, which can require environmental justice groups to mobilize public opinion, garner support from other social movement actors or other community members, influence policymakers, and also engage in electoral politics. One example of that was through the organization We Act for Environmental Justice in New York. We Act enlisted epidemiologists from Columbia University Center for Children Environmental Health to design a study around air pollution. Together, the partnership trained youth to measure street level concentrations of diesel particulates, and they use these cool portable air monitors that are clipped to the youth's backpacks. They also taught the kids truck counting, so basically to count the number of buses, trucks, cars, and pedestrians that pass through busy intersections. And their research showed that particulate emissions were significantly higher than the recommended limits that were set by the US EPA or the Environmental Protection Agency, and provided some of the first evidence tracing particulate exposure to bus exhaust. And so they used this research to mobilize public opinion by creating health workshops for Harlem residents and an ad campaign on city bus shelters. And the policy impact of that was to increase public awareness and support to shift public transportation to cleaner fuels. And another way in which they employed community engaged research in their politics strategy was to garner support from other social movement actors by enlisting the Northeast Environmental Justice Network that provided expert testimony to policymakers. That testimony influenced policymakers' understanding of diesel exhaust health impacts. And through this sort of collaboration on community engaged research, they were able to sort of pressure or work on shifting their public transportation fleet to cleaner fuels. So we are big fans of WEAC's work and project.
I love that. And I feel like it's also introducing not just research, but science to young folks. They're using it on the ground. I'm sure their friends are probably asking them, what is that you're carrying around there, right? So I think it's a really amazing example of how to engage and how those folks can also be, in their way, scientists walking around and being able to share that information and introduce that concept to other folks in the community. Thank you for that example.
Yeah, they also taught the researchers a few things because, they also put some monitors in the schools where the kids were. And the researchers said, we probably should put these air monitors on the roof so, they don't get damaged. And the kids were like, we don't breathe the air up on the roof. We breathe the air that comes in through the windows down here at street level. And we think probably there's more pollution down here at street level than up on the roof. So why aren't you putting the monitors down here at street level? And the researchers were like, oh yeah, I never thought of that. So, the kids taught the researchers some pretty important local knowledge too.
Why that's so important and why we call this book Ground Truths is because that data is so necessary because the state databases for air pollutants, right, don't include what's happening, right, on a day-to-day basis with kids. So what you have now is this huge amount of ground-tested, ground truth data coming from sources, right, that get added to a public database, right? And it makes the robust nature of analysis, et cetera, so much better because it was so limited before. So anything community-based, community-engaged research, particularly when it's related to air pollution or any of these water pollutants, right, that decision-making often relies on limited, full of gaps data, right, by the states. It's really critical.
And this last question is for all three of our guests. What recommendations would you give to environmental and climate justice CBOs who would like to utilize community-engaged research within their advocacy?
One thing that I thought about with this question is thinking about researchers matching their skills to the topics or the interests of community-based organizations. So for me, thinking about partnerships with organizations as, what are the skills that I can lend as a researcher that will be useful for different campaigns or projects that folks are working on. So trying to, I guess, define and work from there, the different kinds of skills that you're offering for, a project or a campaign.
Yeah, I think, one thing we talk about at the end of this chapter is that in addition to doing community engaged research to support particular legal actions or policy campaigns or regulatory fights, it'd be really helpful for researchers to collaborate with communities to promote transformative justice by strengthening the infrastructure of, the tools, the processes, the institutions for conducting community engaged research itself. So one example is we have these wonderful screening tools that have been developed that represent the cumulative impacts of pollution and social vulnerabilities like poverty or linguistic isolation. Cal EnviroScreen here in California has been a really great leading example of that, but there are other states that are developing them as well. And so I'd love to see researchers enlist communities in more ground truthing to improve the accuracy and the comprehensiveness of these data and the usefulness of these mapping tools to communities. And I see that happening. I think we can do more of it. And I think we can also support campaigns to require regulators to consider the cumulative risks when they make a decision about whether to permit a new facility, for example, or to allocate funding to communities that have been overburdened in the past with environmental injustices to make sure that they get more funding. The Biden administration's Justice 40 initiative, which reserves 40% of federal funding for EJ communities, is one example of directing that money to communities that have borne those historic burdens and deserve more support than other communities at this point to ensure that they can address them and remediate them.
It's really an important time for community-engaged research right now. As Chad just mentioned, there's a recognition by even our funding sources that community-engaged research and community knowledge is important, and centering it is key in even the highest level of policymaking in the country. And so for us as researchers and also for community-based organizations doing the work on the front line, organizing or doing advocacy, it's really important to think about coming together in these partnerships, not just tactically or short term or project by project or one-offs, but really in relation to each other, to take advantage of some of these funding sources, for example, right? I mean, there's a conversation right now about some of them funding, perhaps going to groups that have not done work, the deep relational work in communities, right? So how do we make sure that those relationships get built and built over time? I mean, similar to what Chad was saying, having a broader frame around EJ, in addition to sort of the specific data sources that go into lawsuits and advocacy and policy, there is sort of foundationally sort of a relationship commitment that I think we all could make to make community-engaged research, particularly from the researcher side, more robust. So doing more and doing better.
Thank you for that. And given the potential of these collaborations, I'm curious to know, for folks, whether it's on the academic or CBO side, when they want to initially build that relationship, what are some recommendations that you all would give them in terms of approaching folks to collaborate? Like those initial beginning conversations, what does that look like? Because I think for a lot of, whether it's CBOs or academics, it's kind of, building these relationships take time. But I'm curious to know what you can say around what those initial steps can look like.
Yeah, I think this is a question I hear a lot. And I think one of the things I would link back to the other question before this one is that I think, coming to the table with like a potential outcome and the skills that you have to offer is like an important starting point. I think for me and my relationship with the collectiva I work with was sort of my approach. I said, I want to work on this project about this topic that you all have been organizing for. It's really interesting to me and important to me. And these are the things that I can offer in terms of research skills. And this is an outcome I think that might come out of that in terms of like actual like products at the end of it or deliverables. And then kind of talked about what actually would work for them in conversation. So I think, having direct conversations about like, I'm interested in these projects or these campaigns for these particular reasons. These are the skills I can offer and the work that I would like to put into building this relationship and working on this project. And, at the time that I started working with the colectivo, I would go to all of their meetings. And so I think also just spending time with folks and like putting the sweat equity into trust building.
Thank you. I think that's a good point. And what I'm hearing is being clear with your intentions, right? There's nothing you're hiding. This is the outcome. This is what I can offer.
Like what Carolina said about showing up in the community, I think that's really the first step for academic or outside researchers. You have to demonstrate that you care, right? And you have to go meet people and begin to form individual relationships and relationships with organizations, both to understand the diversity of that community and also who might want to collaborate, and to demonstrate your commitment, frankly, to it, that you're not just going to parachute in. And then I think there's other stuff that, like stuff we were supposed to learn in kindergarten that's really helpful to remember here. Like, be a good guest. If you go to somebody's birthday party as a kid, you're supposed to bring a gift. You're a researcher, you're coming into a community, ask yourself what gift you can bring, including research funding or whatever else it is that the community might need at that moment, which might be different from what you think the community needs. Be ready to focus on mutual interests, not just your own interests as an academic. We face a bunch of pressures to publish, particularly, people who are going for tenure, and to publish on a certain timeline and to publish as much as possible. And we really need to kind of bracket that and say, what do my community partners need? And what do I need, right? And then how can we find those mutual interests? And then I think, the other thing you learn in kindergarten is you have to learn how to share stuff. So you don't get to control all the research funding. You don't get to control the definition of the research agenda and the research questions. You have to play well with others. And so, I think those are the kind of first steps.
It sounds like it's definitely a mutual relationship, but being open to changes, right? You're coming in as an expert, but it's giving advice as an expert, right? But then themselves are expert in their own fields and respective fields. So balancing the mutual agreement between both.
I think there's also, in the process of sort of developing the partnerships and coming to know each other and listening and being guests at various different, house parties, is sort of the knowledge, the collective knowledge that gets built. It's like, who is the expert then, right? Right. And then different scenarios or different conditions or different roles, folks will sort of shift and shape, right, to become experts in some field or another. And I think we all wear different hats all the time. And I think our chapter 3 in our book actually is a really unique contribution that really kind of gets at some of these issues, right? How do researchers prepare themselves for walking into a community? What do you need to check yourself with? How do you prepare yourself to go into somebody else's house and community? As Chad mentioned, I think that's a big piece of this. For CEOs coming into the academia, right, it's a sea of really unknown institutional rules and regulations and bureaucracy. We even have a chapter in the book that talks about that, right? How can our institutions, as academic institutions, be changed to accommodate and be more open and transparent? How can our institutions be more equitable in the agreements that we make? One of our authors, Felicia Mitchell, writes about sort of institutional arrangements between tribal governments and in academic institutions, right? What does that look like? So the pathways go both ways, right? But at the heart of it, I think, is what Chad is saying. How can we invoke what we learned in kindergarten to be good guests and good people, right, in relation to others in this research process? So, and I think that in some ways is the gist of the book, in the purpose of advancing environmental justice.
Yeah, and I think what the book is offering is something different from maybe the research training that academics receive in the institution, right? It's like, how can you then, in a way, disrupt those methods to be more inclusive of communities?
Because a lot of people who don't do community engaged research may misinterpret the book as saying your research isn't valid or reliable, ethical. We're not saying that community engaged research is the only kind of research approach that could ever be valuable to the EJ movement or to EJ communities. There can be useful literature reviews that help communities understand what's the state of knowledge and translate it for them. There can be useful studies. Sometimes community groups are too busy doing their own work, and they trust the person they're working with, the researcher, and they're willing to delegate a lot of that work to them. What we are saying is that this community engaged research makes a very unique contribution that really is valuable and that kind of best fulfills the goals of the EJ movement and its understanding of justice, which means that we build power and capacity in the community. We don't just do stuff for the community. I think that's worth mentioning as well. There's also another part of this chapter, which I'm sorry that Zaya Bomani wasn't here to present, but our colleague Zaya Bomani in this chapter really lays out a very different vision of lawyering and how lawyers can collaborate with communities than traditional lawyering. It's called community lawyering, and it really focuses on the attorney respecting and drawing from community expertise and knowledge and taking their cues from the organizers rather than the other way around. So it's not, as Luke Cole, who was great community lawyer on EJ issues, you called it, it's not macho law brains coming in and saying, we're going to save you with our knowledge of the law by bringing a lawsuit, which really marginalizes the community from that process because they're not legal experts. Instead, it's about the lawyer coming in like a good community engaged researcher and saying, what do you all need? What are your priorities? How can the law be one tool in your toolkit of trying to accomplish what you want to do? So I think that's a valuable part of the chapter as well.
Thank you for that. And with that, thank you, Martha, Chad, and Carolina for being with us today. And congratulations on your recently published book.
Thank you, Zully, for hosting today's episode, and thanks to our listeners for joining us on the Just Solutions podcast. Special thanks to our producer, Taylor Ward, and our recording engineer and editor, Angel Batista. If you'd like to support our work to advance climate justice, please consider donating to Just Solutions at justsolutionscollective.org. You can also follow us on Instagram, LinkedIn, Twitter, and Facebook for the latest updates. Together, we are driving community-created and equity-centered solutions to the climate crisis. We hope you'll join us for our next episode.